On a wintry night in early January 1951, as the cold wind cut through the streets of Chicago, the city's underworld stirred once again. The Chicago Tribune, dated January 10th, carried a chilling headline, "Teamsters Shot in Gang-Style Ambush," a grim reminder that the ghosts of Capone's era still haunted the city's labor unions. The target this time was Albert Cease, a 42-year-old organizer for Local 705 of the AFL Teamsters Union. He had just slipped into his car outside his North Kedvale Avenue home when a shadow emerged, a tall man in a grey overcoat. The attacker raised his weapon and fired 7 shots, riddling Cease's vehicle with bullets. 2 rounds found their mark, one in his arm, the other in his back. Miraculously, Cease survived, rushed to St. Anne's Hospital by his wife and brother. But this was no random act of street violence. It was a statement, a warning written in lead and blood. The Chicago Outfit had long used the Teamsters as both a piggy bank and a power base, and with the ongoing Key-Forver hearings exposing their grip on unions, tensions were mounting. Cease had no idea that, at the very moment he was fighting for his life, he was supposed to be named a business agent for the local union. But his colleagues, shaken and jittery, abandoned their plans, fearing that any one of them could be next. Union halls across the city whispered with fear. This wasn't the first time the outfit had made its presence known. In recent years, labor officials had been gunned down, beaten, or outright disappeared under suspicious circumstances. John Russo, a union business agent, had narrowly escaped assassination in 1946, only to die in an accident 3 years later. Tony Cerrone, another union man, was struck down by a car under circumstances police suspected were far from coincidental. Louis Peake was kidnapped, tortured, and forced to open a union safe by gangsters who used lit matches against his bare feet. The message was always the same: the outfit owns this town. Yet officials in Local 705 insisted there was no discord within their ranks, no threats, no warnings, nothing. That was what made it all the more terrifying. The bullets came out of the darkness without so much as a whisper. Police Commissioner O'Connor was considering placing the entire local under protection, but the officers refused. They knew better than to run to the cops. The fear stretched beyond the Teamsters. William A. Lee, president of the Chicago Federation of Labor, had been under 24-hour police guard since November. He had refused to let Capone's old guard muscle into his bakery drivers' union. First, they approached him outside a union hall, telling him flatly, "We want in." When he ignored them, they called his home, trying to lure him to a West Side hotel for a meeting. Lee didn't take the bait. He went straight to the cops, and the threats stopped. But the fear never left. Chicago had seen all this before. The outfit's grip on labor dated back to the Prohibition era, when Al Capone's enforcers learned that union extortion was as profitable as bootlegging. Back then, George "Red" Barker, a Capone strongman, made his move on the Coal Teamsters Union. It wasn't subtle. He had Lefty Lynch, the former boss, shot and left for dead in Wisconsin. When Lynch survived, he came back to Chicago only to find that Barker had already taken his seat at the Union Hall, announcing simply, "I'm the boss now." Barker had backing. 3-fingered Jack White, Klondike O'Donnell, and, most important, Murray Humphreys. Murray, the Camel Humphreys, wasn't just another trigger man. He was the outfit's smooth operator, the architect of labor racketeering, and the man who turned brute force into an art form. He understood that violence wasn't the endgame, it was leverage. He perfected the union shakedown, using strikes and walkouts as weapons more powerful than Tommy guns. You didn't need to kill a man if you could cripple his business. By 1951, Humphreys had moved even deeper into the shadows. His reach extended far beyond labor unions. He was the quiet, calculating figure who ensured that Chicago's political machine, its police force, and its business elite all played by the outfit's rules. While Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo ruled from above, Humphreys operated behind the scenes, securing their power where it mattered most: money, influence, and silence. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Senate's crime committee was circling closer. The Kefauver hearings were peeling back the layers of the outfit's empire, and one name kept appearing: Murray Humphreys. But Humphreys wasn't worried. He never was. The real war was still being fought on the streets of Chicago. On the night of January 19th, 1951, as the wind howled through the streets of Cleveland, the United States Immigration Service was watching closely. In a small federal courtroom packed with reporters, attorneys, and investigators, the Kefauver Committee's crime probe was digging deep into the Chicago outfit's national influence. But one thing became clear: the government wasn't just looking at gambling operations anymore. They were looking at who ran them, and whether those men had any right to be in the country at all. J. Austin Murphy, a top investigator for immigration services, stood outside the hearing room, keeping his cards close to his chest. When asked if the government was preparing deportation cases against key witnesses, he merely smirked and replied, "We're definitely interested." That was all he would say. But it was enough. The outfit was watching this just as closely as the feds. At the center of the hearings was Joe DiCarlo, a stocky Buffalo mobster with ties stretching from New York to Ohio to Miami. The committee had been waiting to grill him about the Pettibone and Mounds clubs, two notorious gambling casinos in Ohio and northern Kentucky. But DiCarlo wasn't the only name on their list. The Kefauver Committee had dragged in Alfred Big Al Polizzi, a former Cleveland mob boss turned Florida real estate kingpin, and James Jack White Licavoli, a man whose criminal record stretched from gambling to kidnapping to murder. The committee's frustration boiled over when these men refused to talk. The hearings had exposed crime rackets from Chicago to Miami, but now the men who ran them were sitting in their seats, staring at the senators with blank faces, as if the outfit's operations were nothing more than rumors. Senator Estes Kefauver wasn't buying it. By the end of the day, federal prosecutors were done playing games. United States District Attorney Don Miller announced that the government would move to indict DiCarlo, Polizzi, and Licavoli for contempt of Congress. If convicted, they could face up to a year in jail, a small price to pay for silence, but a sign that the government wasn't backing down. The investigation wasn't just about gambling. It was about how men like Tony Accardo, Jack Guzik, and Murray Humphreys had built a coast-to-coast empire of influence. The committee wanted to know how, in 1946, James Reagan, the head of Continental Press, had been assassinated after refusing to turn over his wire service to the outfit. Humphreys and Accardo had made him an offer, and when he said no, he was gunned down. But somehow, Arthur McBride, the Cleveland gambling kingpin, managed to buy Reagan's empire without a scratch. Rudolph Halley, the committee's chief counsel, wanted to know why. "Is there any reason you were able to continue the operation of Continental Press without interference when Reagan wasn't able to do it?" Halley asked. McBride shrugged. "I can't say." Why was the magic of the McBride name needed in the wire business? I can't take my name to the bank and get money, and there's no magic in it. McBride was playing dumb, but the committee knew better. The outfit had used violence to consolidate its hold over bookmaking and wire services, just like it had with the Teamsters and the vending machine industry. The murder of Reagan wasn't a coincidence. It was a lesson, and men like McBride had learned it well. As the hearings dragged on, one name kept coming up: Murray the Camel Humphreys. Unlike Tony Accardo, who had inherited the throne from Capone's inner circle, Humphreys had built his own power base. He was the outfit's labor racketeering genius, the man who turned union control into a financial goldmine. If there was a racket, Teamsters gambling, vending machines, wire services. Humphreys had a stake in it. He wasn't just a gangster. He was the man who made sure Chicago's criminal empire ran like a Fortune 500 company. And now, the government was finally closing in. The K-4 Committee's war on organized crime was tearing through the underworld like a wildfire, exposing the deep-rooted corruption that had festered since the Prohibition era. It had started with whispers, murmurs of gambling rackets, stretching from Chicago to Cleveland to Miami. But now, under the glare of the Senate's crime probe, those whispers had turned into damning testimony. At the heart of the hearings was a single question that no one seemed willing to answer. Why was James Reagan assassinated while Mickey McBride was allowed to run Continental Press in peace? Reagan had fought the outfit's grip on the bookie wire service, and it cost him his life in 1946. Before he died, he named names: Tony Accardo, Jack Guzik, and Murray Humphreys, the outfit's ruling class. Reagan's murder had been as precise as it was brutal, a textbook execution designed to send a message. You don't say no to the outfit and live to talk about it. Yet somehow, Arthur Mickey McBride, a former Chicago circulation man turned mob-friendly businessman, was able to buy the wire service without a single bullet fired in his direction. The K-4 Committee wanted to know why. In a packed Cleveland courtroom, Senate Chief Counsel Rudolph Halley pressed McBride with the same question over and over. Is there any reason why you were able to continue the operation of Continental Press without interference when Reagan wasn't able to do it? McBride shrugged. I can't say. Why was the magic of the McBride name needed in the wire business? I can't take my name to the bank and get money, and there's no magic in it. It was the same tired routine the committee had seen before. A man with undeniable underworld ties pretending to be nothing more than an honest businessman. McBride denied knowing Accardo, Guzik, Humphreys, or the Fischetti brothers, but the committee wasn't buying it. McBride had been a lifelong friend of Big Al Polizzi, the Cleveland mob boss who had quietly built a second empire in Coral Gables, Florida. He was also close to John Angasola, a figure with deep Sicilian underworld connections. The committee pressed him further. Did you ever discuss Accardo, Guzik, Humphreys, or the Fischettis with Polizzi or Angasola? No. Was your ability to operate Continental Press due to your friendship with Polizzi and Angasola? Definitely not. McBride scoffed at the entire inquiry, even mocking the investigation's effectiveness. There are more bookies in Florida now than before the crime investigation started. Why? There's one on every corner in Miami. But McBride wasn't the only one refusing to talk. In Miami, 3 key witnesses with outfit connections, Alfred Big Al Polizzi, James LeCavalier, and Joe DiCarlo, sat in front of the Senate's investigators and refused to say a word. The trio had connections stretching across the Midwest and into Florida. DiCarlo, a Buffalo mobster who had spent years building gambling rackets in Cleveland, Youngstown, and Miami, smirked his way through questioning. Dressed in a well-tailored blue business suit, he looked every bit the prosperous businessman he claimed to be. What is your net worth? The committee asked. I have a net worth of nothing. Nothing, except for a Cadillac, an expensive Miami Beach vacation home, and a wardrobe that made it clear he wasn't living hand-to-mouth. LeCavalier, a man with a rap sheet including gambling, kidnapping, and murder, was just as uncooperative. When asked about his involvement in the Buckeye Catering Company, a Cleveland slot machine racket, he clammed up. By the end of the day, U.S. District Attorney Don Miller had enough. He announced that a federal grand jury would be asked to indict Polizzi, LeCavalier, and DiCarlo for contempt of Congress. If convicted, they would face up to a year in prison and $1,000 fines. While the hearings exposed corruption from New York to New Orleans, one thing became increasingly clear. Chicago remained the epicenter of organized crime in America. By January 28, 1951, The Kefauver Committee estimated that organized crime was costing the United States at least $17 billion a year, more than the national defense budget of 1947 and 1948. Murray Humphreys, Tony Accardo, and Jake Guzik had perfected what Capone had only dreamed of: a streamlined, corporate-style criminal empire that touched every major industry: gambling, labor unions, bookmaking, and construction. Senator Kefauver himself summed it up best. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York are major crime centers, but Chicago takes first place. The outfit was bigger than it had ever been. It had evolved from Prohibition-era bloodbaths into a vast multi-state operation that thrived in silence. While Al Capone had relished the spotlight, the men who succeeded him, Accardo, Guzik, and Humphreys, preferred to rule from the shadows. Even as the hearings dragged their names into the open, they never flinched, never testified, never lost a moment of sleep. The senators were learning a hard truth. Crime wasn't just about violence anymore, it was about power, control, and influence. And no one wielded it better than the Chicago Outfit. By February 9th, 1951, the Kefauver Committee's probe into organized crime had escalated from mere hearings to a full-scale manhunt for the outfit's highest-ranking figures. Senatorial arrest warrants were issued for 4 of the most powerful men in Chicago's underworld, men who'd ruled from the shadows since the fall of Al Capone. The Fischetti brothers, Rocco and Charles, had been deeply entrenched in mob affairs for decades, operating as Capone's emissaries in Havana and Miami, ensuring the outfit's gambling rackets thrived far beyond Chicago's borders. Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, the mob's financial mastermind, had long been the bridge between organized crime and political corruption, greasing the wheels of City Hall while keeping the outfit's books in order. But the real prize for the Kefauver Committee was Murray the Camel Humphreys. If Accardo was the boss and Guzik was the financier, Humphreys was the strategist. He wasn't just a thug, he was the architect of labor racketeering, bribery, and silent takeovers. Unlike Capone's era, which relied on brute force, Humphreys built the outfit into a sophisticated machine that infiltrated unions, corporations, and city contracts without a drop of blood spilled, unless absolutely necessary. Yet, as the committee intensified its efforts, none of them could be found. They had vanished. Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Joseph Duke was ordered to hunt them down, enlisting the FBI and other federal agencies. United States Marshals in Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco were carrying subpoenas, but not a single one of them could locate the men. Meanwhile, the committee was also looking for George May, a management consultant with known ties to Capone's old guard. His Tarno Shanta Club was suspected of being a front for a slot machine empire, and the Senate wanted to know just how deep his dealings with the outfit ran. The crime probe wasn't just exposing mobsters. It was also unraveling how crime and politics had become indistinguishable. At the Detroit hearings, Senator Herbert O'Connor was seething. He had just listened to testimony that painted a disturbing picture. Organized crime wasn't just running gambling and labor rackets. It was controlling the very laws meant to stop them. Immigration officials had knowingly allowed dangerous criminals to remain in the country, in some cases, for decades. Take Carlos Marcello, the kingpin of New Orleans. An ex-convict, Sicilian-born, and never naturalized, Marcello wasn't just another gangster. He was a democratic political force in Louisiana, protected by corrupt officials who turned a blind eye to his drug trafficking and gambling empire. Then there was Mono Minaudo, a Detroit mobster with a life sentence for murder in Italy, who had somehow managed to remain in the United States for 26 years without being deported. His criminal record was staggering. Life for murder, 1925. 18 months for organized crime activity, 1927. 30 years for attempted murder and grand larceny, 1932. Yet there he was, sitting before the Kefauver Committee, running a $40,000 a year bowling alley, shrugging as he explained that he had legally had his police records destroyed. Inspector Andrew Mosser of the Immigration Service admitted that Minaudo had been arrested 32 times in the United States for crimes ranging from armed robbery to assault, but was not currently deportable under American law. Senator O'Connor was livid. "This is a miscarriage of justice," he roared. "A glaring instance of how our immigration laws are flouted. This man is virtually a public enemy." But it wasn't just corrupt immigration officials who were protecting the mob. Congressmen were actively intervening to block deportations. The committee revealed that Pete Licavoli, a feared Detroit underworld boss, had been using his connections in Congress to protect his brother-in-law, Frank Camerata, an alien with a major criminal record who was supposed to be deported. A congressman had introduced a bill to stop the deportation, and a senator was personally lobbying for Camerata's protection. Even when confronted, Licavoli refused to answer any questions. O'Connor immediately recommended contempt proceedings. The corruption ran so deep that even the Ford Motor Company was implicated. The committee questioned Harry Bennett, former Ford personnel director, about a lucrative hauling contract that had reportedly been awarded to a gangster associate to prevent his assassination. Bennett denied everything. The committee wasn't convinced. While the Kefauver Committee was unearthing layers of corruption, the Chicago Outfit's leadership was eluding justice with stunning efficiency. The committee issued contempt resolutions for 5 major underworld figures, including Peter Tremont, a Southside policy racket boss, and Joseph Ayupa, a Cicero gambling manufacturer. Yet, as the hearings pressed on, it became increasingly clear that no matter how many subpoenas were issued, no matter how many hearings were held, the real power brokers of organized crime weren't afraid of the Senate. They had seen this before. Back in the 1930s, Capone's empire had been cracked open by the federal government, but instead of dying, it adapted. The new leaders weren't interested in the headlines or the theatrics of Prohibition-era gangland wars. They had transformed crime into a business empire so deeply embedded in American society that removing it would be like tearing out a vital organ. Even Senator Estes Kefauver had to admit, Chicago would appear to take first place as the crime capital of the nation. The Fischetti brothers, Jake Guzik and Murray Humphreys, were still in hiding, and somewhere in the dark corridors of the outfit's strongholds, they were watching the hearings unfold with quiet amusement. They had seen it all before, and they weren't going anywhere. By February 21, 1951, the Senate had reached a boiling point. The Crime Committee, led by Senator Estes Kefauver, wasn't just uncovering organized crime's influence, it was now actively hunting the men who ran it. The committee had already issued subpoenas, but that wasn't enough. 17 of the most powerful men in the underworld had gone into hiding, dodging the government's attempts to drag them into the spotlight. So, on that cold February night in Washington, the Senate passed an extraordinary resolution. Arrest warrants would be issued. The Fischetti brothers, Rocco and Charles, were on the list. So was Murray the Camel Humphreys, the outfit's labor racketeering mastermind. And Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, Capone's old money man who had ensured Chicago's politicians and police were always on the mob's payroll. These were not just mobsters. They were the men who ran organized crime in America. The Senate's Sergeant-at-Arms, Joseph Duke, was now authorized to enlist the FBI and any federal law enforcement agency needed to track them down. It wasn't just about answering questions anymore. This was about taking the leaders of the Chicago outfit into custody. And yet, the outfit was always one step ahead. None of them had been found. A week later, on February 28, 1951, the Kefauver Committee made an even bolder claim. The American underworld wasn't just a collection of criminal gangs. It was an organized underworld government that enforced its own laws, carried out its own executions, and had infiltrated the highest levels of business and politics. The Times published excerpts from the committee's second interim report, which laid out the breadth of the Mafia's grip on the country. In Missouri, the state government had nearly been taken over by organized crime in 1948, with mob-backed politicians and corrupt officials running the show. It had all collapsed in a hail of bullets when Charles Binaggio and Charles Gargotta were assassinated, a power move straight out of Capone's playbook. In New York and New Jersey, gangsters operated high-end casinos that raked in millions each year, untouched by law enforcement. In Florida, political corruption ran so deep that the Capone gang had effectively merged with a local syndicate, controlling the gambling scene from Miami to Tampa. In Chicago, the racing wire service, the backbone of the national bookmaking empire, was controlled by the outfit. The committee directly tied the murder of James Reagan to the Capone syndicate, confirming what had long been suspected. Before he was gunned down in 1946, Reagan went to the Cook County District Attorney and named the men who would kill him: Tony Accardo, Murray Humphreys, and Jake Guzik. These three men, the committee declared, were the true heads of what remained of Capone's empire. One of the most chilling findings in the committee's report was that organized crime wasn't just about gambling, extortion, or murder. It was now embedded in legitimate business. The outfit was no longer just a gang of bootleggers and hitmen. They were businessmen, investors, and property owners. Niji Rosen, a feared Philadelphia mobster, had moved into the dress business. Louis Crusco, a known numbers operator, had invested heavily in a steel company. Frank Livorsi, a New York gangster, became a sugar and jelly distributor during the post-war sugar shortages. The DiGiovanni brothers, powerful Kansas City mobsters, were liquor wholesalers. Charles Binaggio's crew had bought up soda companies, controlling the soft drink market. Joe Adonis, one of the most influential mobsters in America, was now the principal stockholder in the automotive conveying company, which hauled Ford automobiles. Frank Costello, the most politically connected gangster in the country, had diversified into oil, gas, and real estate. The committee's report was clear. The Mafia wasn't just running rackets, it was buying America. And it was still protected by corrupt politicians and police officers who turned a blind eye as long as the money flowed. As the committee neared the end of its mission, Kefauver knew the fight was far from over. Without the connivance of public officials, organized crime would not exist on the scale that it does today, the committee concluded. The solution? A permanent congressional commission on organized crime. A federal task force with the power to keep the heat on the Mafia long after Kefauver's investigation ended. The committee's final report was due in the spring, but Kefauver and his team had already made one thing clear. The Chicago Outfit, led by Accardo, Humphreys, and Guzik, wasn't just the biggest crime syndicate in America. It was the model for every other criminal empire in the country. And even as arrest warrants were issued, subpoenas were ignored, and witnesses vanished. One thing was certain. The outfit was watching and waiting. By March 1st, 1951, the Kefauver Committee had done more than just expose organized crime. It had revealed that the Chicago Outfit wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was an underworld government with national reach. The outfit's influence stretched from Chicago to Missouri, New York, New Jersey, and deep into the heart of Florida. Wherever there was money to be made, whether in gambling, bookmaking, or unions, the Capone syndicate had a foothold. And at the top, Tony Accardo, Murray the Camel Humphreys, and Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, the true heirs of Capone's empire. The committee's second interim report painted a picture that went far beyond simple gambling operations. The mob had evolved. Missouri state government had nearly fallen into mob control in 1948. Political contributions from the underworld propped up Governor Forrest Smith's campaign. But when mob power brokers Charles Binaggio and Charles Gargotta were murdered, It sent shockwaves through the system, a reminder that crime and politics were indistinguishable. In Florida, Capone's old empire had taken root, embedding itself into local gambling syndicates and using its financial muscle to dictate which bookies were raided and which were left alone. In New York and New Jersey, the most powerful gangsters controlled casinos that pulled in millions a year, all under the watchful eye of mob overlords like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. In California, Jack Dragner was declared a Mafia leader, having seized control of the West Coast racing wire service. And then there was James Reagan, the man who tried to fight back against the outfit and paid for it with his life. Before he was gunned down in 1946, Reagan had gone to the Cook County District Attorney and given the names of the men he believed would kill him: Tony Accardo, Murray Humphreys, and Jake Guzik. The committee made it official. These men weren't just running the Chicago outfit. They were the core of the national crime syndicate. The committee zeroed in on the racing wire service, the lifeline for bookmaking operations across the country. Every major bookmaker, from New York to California, depended on wire service results to set odds and cash bets. And who controlled the wire service? Not its supposed owner, Edward McBride, but the Chicago outfit. Continental Press, which dominates the racing wire service and the nation's bookmakers, is owned not by its supposed operator, but by gangsters who constitute the Capone syndicate, the committee declared. This was the Chicago outfit's golden goose, allowing them to control the flow of information to every bookie in the country. The outfit didn't just take bets. They dictated how every bet was played. But what the committee found most disturbing was how seamlessly the mob was integrating itself into legitimate business. The outfit wasn't just an illegal empire, it was an economic force. Nig Rosen, a feared Philadelphia mob boss, had moved into the dress business. Louis Crusco, a numbers operator, had purchased a steel company for $34,000, a front for laundering illicit cash. Frank Livorsi, a New York gangster, had bought into the jelly business during a post-war sugar shortage. Joe Adonis, once a Brooklyn bootlegger, had become the principal stockholder of an automotive company that hauled Ford automobiles. Frank Costello, the political mastermind of the Underworld, had shifted his focus to oil, gas, and real estate holdings. The message was clear. The Underworld wasn't just about gambling dens, liquor rackets, or slot machines anymore. The mob was infiltrating the industries that Americans depended on every day. The committee didn't just blame the gangsters. They made it clear. Organized crime thrived because politicians and law enforcement let it. Without the connivance of public officials, these conditions would not prevail, the report stated. In Missouri, Chicago, and Florida, the connections were undeniable. Missouri's governor had taken contributions from known mobsters. Florida law enforcement had orchestrated raids on rival bookies, while protecting outfit-backed operations. Local sheriffs, judges, and mayors across the country looked the other way as long as the money flowed. Even in Phoenix City, Alabama, where the mob's grip wasn't as firm, the corruption was blatant. A local gambler named Pete Hargett had been beaten nearly to death after being accused of running a bug lottery with Columbus, Georgia customers. But when pressed, he refused to name names. "I have no intention of causing anybody else any trouble," he told reporters from his hospital bed. It was the same story across the country. No one talked because they knew what happened to people who talked. As the committee's investigation neared its final months, Kefauver and his team knew they had built a case too big to ignore. They had exposed the national reach of the Chicago outfit. They had proven that the racing wire service was controlled by the mob. They had shown how crime families were buying up legitimate businesses to launder their fortunes. And, most damningly, they had pulled back the curtain on law enforcement corruption, proving that organized crime couldn't exist without political protection. Now, it was up to Congress to decide. The committee's final recommendation? A permanent federal commission dedicated to fighting organized crime, because if the government didn't act, the outfit would only grow stronger. The Senate had ordered arrests for the top figures in the Chicago outfit, but one fact remained. Accardo, Humphreys, and Guzik were still in hiding. And no one, not the committee, not the FBI, not the marshals, could touch them. They had built something bigger than Capone ever dreamed of, and they weren't going anywhere. By March 21, 1951, the federal government had finally taken aim at what truly mattered to the Chicago outfit: money. The Bureau of Internal Revenue, under Commissioner George J. Schoeneman, announced that it was conducting a full-scale tax investigation into some 1,700 underworld figures, including some of the most powerful names in organized crime: Frank Costello, the political mastermind of the New York underworld; Joe Adonis, Brooklyn's silent powerhouse; Jack Greasy Thumb Guzik, the financial architect of the Chicago outfit; Meyer Lansky, the man who made organized crime international; Tony Accardo, the reigning boss of the Chicago outfit; Murray, the camel, Humphreys, the outfit's labor racketeering genius; Paul, the waiter, Rika, the man who pulled strings from behind the scenes. For decades, the outfit had operated above the law, using bribes and political influence to shield themselves from prosecution. But there was one weapon even they couldn't ignore: tax evasion. Schoeneman handed over a previously undisclosed list of 126 major underworld figures, detailing where they were most active. The names read like a who's who of the Mafia and the outfit's national network. Ralph and John Capone, Al Capone's remaining family still operating in Chicago; Mickey Cohen, Los Angeles' most notorious gangster; Vito Genovese, the man positioning himself to take over New York's most powerful family; Alfred Polizzi, Cleveland's exiled mob boss turned Florida real estate mogul; John Roselli, the outfit's connection to Hollywood and Las Vegas; Joe Fischetti, outfit lieutenant and international gambling racketeer; Phil Castell, the outfit's New Orleans money man, working under Frank Costello; Sam Golfbag Hunt, Chicago's top enforcer. This was the biggest coordinated effort yet to take down the outfit and its affiliates nationwide. In the last 4.5 years, the IRS had investigated 1,671 racketeers and recommended tax assessments totaling $129 million. But now, with 374 of these cases being prioritized, the pressure was mounting. During the past 4.5 years, 248 racketeers have been prosecuted for tax evasion, Schoeneman reported. We think this spells out not only real efforts, but successful efforts as well. The message was clear. If the government couldn't take them down for murder, extortion, or corruption, they'd do it through the IRS, just like they did with Capone. Meanwhile, March 29, 1951, marked a moment of frustration for the Senate Crime Investigating Committee. Despite months of aggressive hearings, 4 of the most important witnesses remained on the run. Tony Accardo, the de facto boss of the Chicago outfit, having succeeded Paul Rika; Murray Humphreys, the architect of the outfit's labor racketeering empire; Charles Fischetti, outfit lieutenant, heavily involved in gambling and Havana casinos; Rocco Fischetti, the outfit's link to Cuba and international operations. The committee had issued warrants, enlisted the FBI, and pressured informants, yet none of them had been found. They had simply disappeared, taking their secrets with them. Senator Alexander Wiley of Wisconsin called it unacceptable. "The Chicago crime picture is unfinished," he declared. "The committee's work must continue." Despite resistance from some Democrats, Republicans were pushing to extend the committee's lifespan, arguing that the full truth about the outfit had yet to be revealed. With Chicago still under investigation, Florida's deep mob ties exposed, and tax evasion cases moving forward, it became evident that the Kefauver hearings had only scratched the surface of America's criminal empire. The Senate Crime Committee was set to expire in just days, but there was growing demand for a permanent commission on organized crime, one that wouldn't just investigate for a few months, but continuously track the Mafia, the outfit, and their grip on American industries. Even as the government closed in, Accardo, Humphreys, and the outfit's elite remained untouchable. They had learned from Capone's mistakes, and for now, the real power of organized crime still sat in the shadows, pulling the strings of America's underworld.